Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are some iconic places in this country that define America. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern Alaska is one of those places. It is a one-of-a-kind treasure. And today, for the first time, the full House of Representatives has an opportunity to cast a vote to permanently preserve and protect this special place. Now, my Republican friend, Mr. Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, has joined me in introducing the underlying bill that is incorporated in this amendment. And together, we are carrying the torch that prior generations of bipartisan leaders have carried. They've understood that America's Arctic is a uniquely wild place. It was Republican President Dwight Eisenhower who first established federal protections for the coastal plain in 1960, and Democratic Chairman Mo Udall who expanded the refuge, doubling its size in 1980. Now, I had the great privilege to visit the Arctic Refuge last summer. I camped in the wilderness, and I came away with an increased sense of urgency to permanently protect the refuge's coastal plain. Allowing drilling in the Arctic Refuge would irreparably disrupt a very important ecosystem. It would impact the way of life for the Gwich'in people and forever destroy one of our nation's last great wild places. And that's why I'm offering this amendment to the SHARE Act, to ask that we protect this American wilderness once and for all. Now, my amendment would designate the threatened biological heart of the refuge, the coastal plain, as wilderness, to finally recognize the intrinsic value of this land and what it holds, to ensure that it remains pristine for generations to come. Congress has been debating whether to drill in this area for nearly 3 decades. As our public lands suffer from the effects of climate change, most significantly in Alaska, I believe time is of the essence. Now, the Arctic Refuge is wild, it's spectacular, and most important, it is owned by all Americans, not by the oil industry. That's why Congressman Fitzpatrick and I introduced our bipartisan legislation to permanently designate it as wilderness, following the bipartisan legacy that this legislation has enjoyed for decades. Now, Arctic Refuge support has always been diverse and nationwide. During the recent public comment period for the draft conservation plan, the Fish and Wildlife Service received nearly 1 million comments in support of wilderness for the Arctic Refuge and in opposition to oil and gas exploration and development. Alaskans showed overwhelming support at public hearings and sent thousands of comments, including from 100 businesses across the state, from Kaktovik to Juneau. This legislation has been introduced in every Congress for almost 3 decades and has never come to a full vote on the House floor. So I'm grateful that in January of 2015, for the first time, the Department of Interior released a conservation plan for the refuge that recommended wilderness protection, a recommendation that was transmitted to Congress. But only Congress can act to designate the coastal plain as wilderness, and now is the time to seize that historic opportunity. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska seek recognition?
Claiming time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, I always admire my friend from California who doesn't know squat about the Arctic Wildlife Range. That's the truth. You may have camped out in it, but you didn't camp out in the area which we would like to drill in oil that this Congress set aside for a purpose. And by the way, we did pass opening ANWR 11 times. This Congress did. And it got stopped in the Senate every time but one, and Bill Clinton, bless his heart, vetoed it. We have 18 billion barrels of oil, that's a minimum estimate, 74 miles away from an existing pipeline on the coastal plain. 18, you say, well, we don't need the oil now. I heard that in 1960. We didn't need the oil, but it went all the way up to $4.50, gasoline at the pump. This is a reserve set aside by Scoop Jackson, a Democrat, myself, and Ted Stevens, so it would be eventually there for development when Congress acts. To put this in a wilderness area now on the behalf and behest of a group of people that really don't understand this. You say Alaska supports your amendment? In that case, I won't be back here next year. Don't applaud. Don't keep that in mind. But I've been running now longer than anybody in this House with one other man. And apparently Alaska does support this ANWR provision. It is federal oil. It's not our oil. We have an infrastructure in place right now. that can be used to move that oil if and when it's needed. And I'm glad the gentleman said only the Congress would designate this, because your Fish and Wildlife recommended all be wilderness. Another act of this administration. And I happen to agree, very frankly, that the Congress will vote someday, when and where, and by the way, you want to get rid of me, take a vote for it, to open it up, and I might retire. But until that time, I'm staying here. Because it's right for this nation. With the time, I yielded Mr. McClick. California, I know that. About 1.5 minutes. I don't know how much time I got left.
Recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would forbid development of one of the most promising and untapped oil fields in the world. And I have to ask, how's the cause of American energy independence advanced by forbidding development of America's own vast energy resources? We're talking about reserves that are larger than the reserves in the entire nation of Mexico or Norway, from which we currently depend on importing oil. And the gentleman from California is right, that land is owned by the American people, so is the oil under it, and that means about $300 billion of revenues into the federal treasury. That's about $2,400 for every family in this country. The proposed development of the Arctic oil requires about 2,000 acres out of 19 million acres of the wildlife reserve. That is 1/100th of 1% of that land area. That is how extreme this measure is. It would sacrifice American prosperity. It would sacrifice oil reserves larger than in all of Mexico. It would sacrifice revenues to the Treasury of $2,400 for every family, to place off limits a tiny part of the frozen Arctic tundra. If you want to know why our economy is stagnating, if you want to know why our country is going bankrupt, you need only to look to measures like the amendment before us. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With great respect to the senior legislator from Alaska, I have no doubt that he knows and understands the coastal plain and that area far better than I do and that anyone else in this body does. But I do know this. Every member of this body, in fact, every American, has a stake in protecting the coastal plain of the Arctic wilderness. Migratory birds from the coastal plain go to all 49 of the other states. We are connected, whether we know it or not, with this critically vital ecosystem in the Alaska Wildlife Refuge. And the whole point of wilderness is to protect areas that we actually may never camp out in, that we may never see, but that are nevertheless of such great intrinsic value that they deserve this special protection. That's what this is all about. Now, as to the argument that we need lots of new oil extraction and development in the Arctic, I would just point out that right next door to the Arctic Refuge is an enormous, essentially equal-sized area that we set aside for that purpose. It's called the National Petroleum Reserve, and the oil industry has not seen fit to develop in that area, nor does it look like they will anytime soon, with oil hovering around $30 a barrel, and this week the Saudis saying they may be fine taking it all the way down to $20 a barrel. Right now, because of its overdependence on the oil economy, the state of Alaska is hemorrhaging. Oil revenues are down by half. The permanent fund is hemorrhaging. Meanwhile, the tourist economy, which is built around preserving and protecting natural resources, is growing and will soon eclipse oil revenues in terms of the economic
Gentleman's
impact.
time has
Let's look to the
expired.
future.
Gentleman from Alaska with 1 minute, 15 seconds remaining.
I want to thank the chair. I always listen to these arguments well written by the Sierra Club and the other people who like to take this nation to its knees, which is reality. We talked about the petroleum reserve set aside. It was a reserve set aside for use by this nation, and they are drilling. They are drilling today. ConocoPhillips is going in. But ironically, for some reason, the sales that were put up by this administration is not where they wanted to drill. I have an old saying, and people laugh at me when I say it, you don't hunt rabbits on a pool table just because it's green. All right? You don't drill oil if it's not there. And ironically, this administration, bless their hearts, they put up sales, there was nothing there. It was like the pool table. So why would the oil company go drill? They can't and will not. The choices, and I always ask them, why don't you ask the oil companies where you'd like to drill? Oh, we can't do that because someone's asked us to preserve that great area. The other area is just as pretty, but it doesn't have any oil. This is an attempt to take 18 billion barrels of oil away from the American people. An attempt by special interest groups to make sure this country cannot grow. Oil will be here forever. Let's keep it. Let's take and oppose this amendment. It's mischievous. It's wrong for this nation.
Expired. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from California.
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings.